Hi again. In this last video for the module, we're going to talk about different strategies that we might use for improving walking and biking systems. So in the last video, we went into some detail about different user groups for bicycling and the different needs that those user groups might have. Bicycle planners have recently used this system of 4 types of cyclist as a simplified way of thinking about different types of users and the types of facilities that are most appropriate for them. These types are organized based on the amount of tolerance that different cyclists might have for interacting with traffic. And so at the very high end of that spectrum, we have something called a strong and fearless cyclist. This might be typified by the roadie cyclist that we talked about in the last video, maybe the urban cyclist that's comfortable riding in traffic. And this makes up actually a very small proportion of the cyclist population, somewhere around 1 or 2%. And then below that, we have what we might describe as enthusiastic and confident cyclists. These are folks that might be comfortable using a typical bike infrastructure like a bicycle lane. So still, near traffic, but maybe not right in traffic. And those make up a bit larger proportion, maybe around 15%. And then under that, we have a fairly large user group called interested but concerned cyclists. These are folks for whom cycling might be kind of a new activity. They're interested in the possibility, but they're pretty cautious. And they want facilities that are fairly separated from traffic, where they're not interacting with fast-moving vehicles. And this type of cyclist is actually really the target for a lot of bicycle planning. It's how do we get more of these folks that are interested, but might be concerned about their safety while out cycling. And then finally, it's important to recognize that there is a user group called No Way, No How. We're just not going to cycle. And that's okay. It's important for cycling advocates and planners to understand that there are people that, just no matter what you put out there in terms of infrastructure, they're just not going to feel comfortable doing it. So the reason I bring up these 4 types of cyclists is that they map onto this system that is also widely used by bicycle planners called levels of traffic stress, which describe how different roadways with different characteristics might be more or less stressful for cyclists. And the strong and fearless cyclists might be comfortable with a fairly high stress roadway. So that's described by the level at the top here, LTS4, where you have fairly high traffic speeds and volumes and fairly low separation from that traffic. Maybe at best you have a bike lane that's right directly next to high-speed traffic, and maybe at worst you don't have a bike lane at all. Whereas the larger group of interested but concerned riders might only be comfortable at what we call an LTS1 facility. That's something that has fairly low speeds or volumes of traffic, or really high separation. So this could be something like an off-street path where you're just not interacting with traffic at all. And so if we want to increase the adoption of cycling by these folks that are interested but concerned, and remember they make up really a large proportion of the population, then it's important for us to build facilities that are in this lower stress category and make sure that there's a lot of connectivity across our cities that is within this LTS1 category. So a way that we can use these levels of traffic stress in our analyses for bicycle planning is to map them. And this is a fairly resource-intensive exercise. It takes a lot of data in order to look street by street and say, what is the LTS classification for that street? And so here you can see that most neighborhood streets, which have fairly low volumes of traffic, are LTS1. And then there are these corridors along arterials and collectors that might have higher traffic speeds, might not have adequate separation with existing bicycle facilities. And so those are at higher levels of LTS, higher levels of stress. And then a useful analysis that we can do with this is to remove the areas that are high stress and then think about what are these islands of connectivity within which, for example, an interested but concerned rider would feel comfortable going, and where are the barriers to a user like that going elsewhere in the city. So, if you can only ride a bicycle within this small area, maybe it's not very useful to you. But if we build a better bicycle network that allows you to bridge between these islands and move across the city, then that might be a lot more helpful. And so this sort of LTS connectivity analysis is a really central part to a lot of contemporary bicycle planning. So as we think about different strategies that we might use to improve low-stress connectivity, let's step back for a second and think conceptually about two different approaches that we could use in order to make a place fairly low stress for cyclists. And then we'll also think about this in the context of walking, because really a lot of the same concepts apply. So one way that we could achieve this is through separation. It's by taking cyclists or pedestrians and putting them in a place where they're just not going to encounter traffic. So this is the Greenway in Minneapolis that was built on an old rail bed. And so all the cross streets actually go above this Greenway. You can travel for a few miles here without actually encountering any surface traffic. And so this is clearly very attractive for folks who might have a fairly low tolerance for interacting with traffic, because there's just never actually an opportunity for you to interact with traffic. A contrasting approach has to do with inclusion, with bringing users of many modes together in the same space and essentially trying to slow down and give opportunities for all of those users to, interact with one another gracefully, maybe make eye contact, yield to one another. And so this has the potential to be a little bit more complex in the way that the traffic pattern works, but it also means that we might not have to build separated facilities that might take up a lot of space or have a significant expense to them. If we can try to better accommodate many users all using the same space in a more flexible way, then that might just be a much more efficient approach. This concept of inclusion also acknowledges that there are always going to be circumstances where you need to, get off of a separated path and, maybe make your way into a space that's just inherently mixed, something like a main street. And so designing those places in a way that they are inclusive to multiple users, where those users can fluidly mix with one another in a safe and probably fairly low speed way, is a really important aspect of designing those spaces. So this example is from UC Davis, which has an incredibly strong bicycle culture. You can see in this example that bicyclists are almost acting like the cars in this case. Motor vehicles can travel in this area, although I believe it's a bit restricted, but certainly service vehicles might be in here. But bicycles are essentially, using the street as vehicles. Bicyclists actually obey these roundabouts and move around them as cars would. And so this is a space where, bicyclists basically just feel like they're a part of the street as opposed to sort of being pushed to the side of it. Another great example of this sort of space is the bicycle boulevard system that we have in many of the Bay Area cities, where bicyclists are just part of the traffic there, and vehicle traffic is calmed in these spaces in an effort to make cycling feel safer and more welcome. But we're not putting the cyclists in a separate lane. We're putting them on a street that feels suitable for that activity in a shared space. Within a pedestrian context, the sort of iconic shared space is called a wonerf. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. It's a Dutch term. So these spaces in the Netherlands are specifically designed so that all modes travel at about the speed of pedestrians. So clearly this is not a high mobility place, but nonetheless, cars, are allowed to travel in these spaces. Bicyclists certainly can travel in these spaces. But there's a lot of design intention put into discouraging high speeds, making it very difficult to drive at high speeds, so that these places feel like they're sort of pedestrian scale, pedestrians feel comfortable there, and streets therefore become these important sort of social places, places that people can gather for a variety of different activities. Play is very encouraged on these streets, which is very different than the sort of American paradigm of don't play in the street. The whole idea here is to play in the street, to gather in the street, to have these be very inclusive pedestrian places. And so this model is increasingly coming to the U.S. Actually, the bicycle boulevard system is in some senses modeled on the Wernhof, but it definitely has not quite gone to the extreme. And a big part of this has to do with traffic calming tactics. Using things like speed bumps, you might install something called a chicane, which is designed to basically stick out into the roadway and force cars to navigate around it, which means that you just can't drive at high speed in a straight line. These are all sort of counter to a lot of prototypical vehicle engineering standards that are about moving efficiently and in a straight and sort of unencumbered way, but they really help to make streets places where cars don't just dominate, but instead have to share that space with other users. At a very radical end of the spectrum is this example from a town called Poynton, which is in the UK, where they made a shared space at the center of town and at the junction of a couple of fairly large and heavily trafficked highways. So this is not a space with low traffic volumes, but it is a place where they managed to really dramatically reduce traffic speeds and therefore sort of put motor vehicles and pedestrians and bicyclists a little bit more at the same level, so that they're all interacting with one another a little bit more fluidly. It feels like a space that's shared between these modes. And so I encourage you to go to YouTube and check out the video. It's called Poynton Regenerated, and it will show you how the traffic pattern works here. But in essence, what they did is they actually removed all of the typical intersection control. So there are no more stoplights in this intersection. They actually removed all the curbs. They removed the lane markings, and instead they replaced that with paving bricks that were different colors that sort of insinuated, here is the road space, and also sort of insinuated that these were roundabout areas where cars would move in a circular motion like you would in a typical roundabout, but didn't actually enforce any of that. And so this left it up to drivers to figure out how to navigate these spaces, usually at low speeds, and while making a lot of eye contact with other drivers, making eye contact with pedestrians. So what this demonstrates is that in some senses, there may be some benefit to removing structure from roadways, removing, the signals that tell everyone what to do all the time, so that drivers have to do a little bit more thinking about, how am I interacting with other people? How am I avoiding a collision? And probably slowing down considerably in order to, make those negotiations in a dynamic way. And that those types of spaces where drivers are really, thinking and watching carefully might be a lot more suitable for sharing with bicycles and pedestrians. So let's take a step back for just a moment and think about this question of what makes a place walkable? What is walkability? And to start with, let's look at potentially sort of an outmoded perspective on this. This is a diagram from the Highway Capacity Manual, which is an important standards manual used in traffic engineering. And this manual suggests that a more walkable place might be a place where you have less pedestrian traffic, so you essentially have no congestion on a sidewalk, and that a less walkable place is a place where you have a lot of congestion, a lot of traffic, maybe a lot of people to weave in and out of. And what's interesting about this approach is that it assumes that pedestrians behave much like vehicles and that we prefer places where there's basically nobody else around, and therefore you can just move fluidly. And in fact, this turns out really to not be the case. Pedestrians much prefer, if you think about really vibrant pedestrian landscapes, in many cases they're packed. You've got a lot of people who are interested in being out and about in maybe a commercial space. So another approach to walkability has to do not with the extent to which walkers are mobile. This is really, what this diagram is about. What is my degree of mobility as a pedestrian? But rather with the accessibility to different destinations that a pedestrian might want to go to. And so this is the underlying premise of Walk Score, which you may have encountered, which essentially rates places based on how close things are, like grocery stores and restaurants. And so as you can see, some of the downtown areas in Berkeley and maybe the 4th Street area, areas around shopping centers, are considered fairly walkable because there's just a lot that you can get to within a short distance on foot. But you still might have to ask yourself, would you want to walk along a really big highway in order to get to a place that's close? That may still not feel like a particularly walkable environment. And so something that I want to point out and that I think is an important area for growth in analyzing walkability has to do with bringing urban design into our analyses, thinking about spaces that are really enjoyable to be in. This is an example out of Alan Jacobs's book called Great Streets, where he goes through and thinks about what are the design qualities that make really great places to be in. And this really highlights again how land uses on either side of a transportation network might have a really important role in how people use and perceive the value of that transportation network. It's not just about what's within the right of way, what's on the street, the sidewalk, but really the things to either side that might make a place enjoyable and comfortable to be in. So just for example, some things that we could consider on an urban design level have to do with the proportions of the space. Some of the most walkable places, really feel like outdoor rooms. They've got these proportions on an architectural level. So again, it's not just the right of way, but really importantly, the things to either side that give some shape and some sense of scale to that space. Trees can play a really important role in adding some enclosure to streets that might be a little bit larger. And then trees, of course, have a lot of other benefits like providing shade. They in and of themselves might be aesthetically pleasing. They provide stormwater filtration and some air quality benefits. And so doing a better job of installing and maintaining street trees might be one of the fairly easy ways that we could substantially improve the walkability of a lot of urban spaces. Thinking on a slightly longer timeline, design guidelines and reforms to zoning that are more related to the form of places, the designs of those places, rather than just the land uses that are in them, might be a really important tactic for reforming the way that people perceive these places as being viable for modes such as walking and biking. And so this again highlights how I think we need to think sort of holistically in planning about using land use and transportation systems together and planning places that accommodate modes like walking, both in terms of the transportation infrastructure, but also the land uses that are adjacent to those transportation infrastructures.